Is called to order at 7 p.m. I'm going to start by reading the land acknowledgement. The City of Albany recognizes that we occupy the land originally protected by the Confederated villages of Lishan. We acknowledge the genocide that took place on these lands and must make strides to repay the moral debt owed to this indigenous people, the Albany tribe. We thank them for their contributions, which have transformed our community and will continue to bring forth growth and unity. The City of Albany commits to sustaining ongoing relationships with the tribe and together build a better future for all that now make this their home.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and do the roll call. Member Bierce is absent. Member Fasoon? Member Hodges is currently absent. Member Larson, also currently absent. Member Lieberman? Here. Member Melgen?
Here.
And Chair Vale McClanahan?
Here. We'll move now to the approval of the minutes from November 20th. Does anyone have any questions about the minutes? And is there any public comment about the minutes?
No public comment.
Super. Okay. And anyone want to make a motion to approve the minutes?
Yeah, I'll motion to approve them.
I'll second.
Okay. Member Fasoon?
Yes.
Member Lieberman?
Yes.
Member Melgen?
Yes.
And Chair Vale McClanahan?
Yes. All right, now it is time for public comment for any item not on the agenda tonight.
Lucinda Young, go ahead.
Lucinda, if you're speaking, we can't hear you. There we go. Now we can hear you.
Okay, now you can hear me. Okay,
go ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry about that. I wanted to make a comment on behalf of the Albany Climate Action Coalition. The Albany librarian has requested presentations on sustainability for next year. And so the Climate Action Coalition has had some meetings with the Albany librarian, and Michelle joined us for one of those meetings. And so we are planning a series of sustainability presentations for next year. And I wanted to let you know that the very first one is scheduled for January 26th from 3 to 4:30. And the topic is going to be on home electrification, the climate emergency, and why home electrification is a important action for climate, and discussing the various rebates that are available. And we have lined up a presenter from, he's currently, or has just finished up his tenure as mayor and vice mayor. He had served as both, of Lafayette, and he's also a climate reality trained leader, trained with Al Gore, and he has agreed to speak at the presentation. I have heard his presentation before earlier this year, and he's an excellent speaker, both giving an overview of the climate emergency and how he went about completely electrifying his home. So we will give you more information when the details are worked out, but I hope that some members of the committee will be able to attend that. And Michelle has agreed graciously to speak at that, also providing information on the Albany rebates. Thank you.
No other public comment.
Okay, thanks for your comment, Lucinda. Now for any announcements.
Yeah, Lucinda actually just took one of mine, as you would expect. So you all just heard about that upcoming event at the library. I have two other small announcements. The first is that the California e-bike incentive program launched very recently. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a presentation later tonight. But that's a program that offers up to $2,000 as an incentive for an e-bike for income qualified households. You have to be at or below 300% of the federal poverty level. And I actually saw on their website today that the first period has already filled up with applicants, and so they're going to be opening other windows later on, but it looks like those are going pretty quick. So that's announcement one. And then the second announcement is that the application for advisory bodies is now open. I mentioned last month that you would need to reapply if you'd like to continue being on the CAC, or if anyone in the public would like to apply to be on the Climate Action Committee or any other committee. So that application is now open on the city website. And that process of, the city council reappointing or appointing applicants will be ongoing through January, maybe stretching into February. There's some overlap, so you may be able to continue into the January meeting, even if you're not reappointed, just depending on, who appoints who, how quickly. So I'll be in touch with each of your members just to make sure you're clear on, what's happening with that, and whether you can attend to the January meeting. If you have any questions about that, just let me know. And that's all I have for tonight.
I do have a question about that. There were a few folks I had encouraged to apply in the past when we previously had an opening. If they were not selected, are their applications still active, or do they need to do a new one?
That's a great question. From what I know, those applications stay on file, and they're not automatically gotten rid of or anything. But the newer the application, I think, the more likely they are to succeed, and also just to kind of show that they're still interested. So it might be wise to reapply, even if it's the same submission. But the city clerk, the clerk email would be the best place to go to get a very, very clear answer on that.
Thank you. Does anyone on the committee have any announcements? All right. We have no presentations tonight, so we're going to hop on over to item 6.1, potential strategies for supporting EV charging in multifamily buildings.
Okay. Just a moment. Okay, so this item is a bit of a follow-up from an item that I presented on, I believe it was in January of this year, discussing our multifamily building EV charging pilot program. So I'll go over a little bit of a summary of that since it's been a while, and also just talk about some of the things I've been thinking about and researching in that time. The last we spoke about it, the committee expressed that they were interested in a second round of pilot funding or some sort of larger program. And we talked about a few different potential strategies or pathways for that. So I've been looking into that a bit. So I'm going to talk about the things that I've found and some possibilities and recommendations. So again, just to summarize the original pilot program, this was a pilot, just a small pilot to install EV chargers in multifamily buildings. It was really focused both on technical assistance and funding for the charger installation. We had a $50,000 budget. This was funded from the Measure DD utility users tax. And we split it out into a maximum of $15,000 each for 3 separate buildings, and then $500 of discretionary funds for, outreach and those sorts of things. And we limited it to the 8 to 20 unit buildings, which are the most common type in Albany, and also just a little smaller scale and easier for this kind of project. And we did require the building owners to contribute to the project cost. They ended up paying 20%, and the city covered 80%. So we did the project, we did installations in 3 buildings that are listed here. We got a good amount of variety between the buildings, just in sort of the type of building and the type of installation. 2 of them had 12 units and 1 had 8. We had a little bit of variety in terms of age. In 1234 Solano, we had very low electrical capacity, and so we were only able to install 2 chargers using a load management system, and we sort of separated those out so that 4 of the parking spaces had access to the chargers. In 1100 Portland, that one had tons and tons of electrical capacity, and so they sort of maxed out the number of chargers they could install using all 15,000 of the program funding. So that was 11 chargers. And then 1126 Marin, this one was a little bit more complicated. It had more capacity, but not that much. And, the garage was a little bit of a weird layout. So we ended up putting in 5 chargers to give access to all 8 of the spaces. And all 3 of these projects used level 2 240 volt charging units that were smart-ish. They had the capacity to do tracking, to limit which users could use the charger. They were able to integrate with automatic payment systems, but they weren't also not like the top of the line types of chargers, the really fancy ones. So they were sort of a good middle ground for this type of use case. This is a summary of the cost. I'll thank Mark for pointing out that I had one of the numbers wrong. It was switched in the report. So the average cost per charger here, you can see for 1100 Portland that had the most chargers, the average cost per charger was the lowest, which is what we expect at scale. For 1126 Marin, it was the highest because there were some complications with that building. I won't go into a ton of detail here, but the cost varied, and it was not an absolutely massive cost, but relatively high to the point that it didn't seem likely that these projects would have happened without the pilot project funding. And that goes ahead to lead into some of the main program insights we had, from the process of completing these projects. There were a few main threads that stuck out. The first was that there was a really significant need for technical assistance among the building owners. Generally speaking, they had very, very little existing knowledge of EV charging options and what the different options would look like and what might work for their building. And they were just pretty overwhelmed when they started, hearing about all the possibilities. I heard from 2 of the owners that there's no way they would have even pursued EV charging if it weren't for this program and how much really hand-holding we did. So that was a big thing. Another thing was the cost. As you'd imagine, that was a major concern. We did basically an information session and a survey of owners, and we asked how much they were willing to spend on EV charging, and most of them said between $2,000 and $5,000. and another significant chunk said under $2,000. None of the projects were that inexpensive, obviously, right? So it's about in line with how much they ended up spending when they paid 20% of the project cost. But, you know, the willingness to pay for this is not huge. Along the same lines, payment method was a big concern. This is, you know, how do the tenants pay for the electricity they're using? One of the biggest questions that came up whenever I started talking to any building owners about it was, okay, but I don't want to pay for the electricity that charges their EV, which, you know, is reasonable enough. And, you know, there are some different options for how to do this. There's lots of solutions, but they all have pros and cons. Manual billing is very possible, especially on a smaller scale, but what we found was that for the building owners, you know, adding one more thing to deal with every month and trying to chase people down for varying amounts of money, it's really time intensive. It's a lot of stress. They're not very interested in doing that. There are automated payment programs, you know, software that connects with the chargers and just tracks how much energy the tenants are using. It can even do like, how much does the energy cost at the moment that they're using it? It can automatically bill their credit or debit cards. It's very powerful technology. The downside to that is that these things cost about $200 a year per charger. And when you start factoring in, you know, how much tenants would be saving on fuel costs by switching over, it's really, really starting to eat into that savings. And it takes a big hit to the, you know, the potential financial and equity benefits of switching over to EVs. And we know that that's a cost that's going to be essentially, you know, passed down to the user. So that was another kind of tension that we found. And then finally, electrical capacity. This is a massive issue. A lot of our buildings here in Albany, a lot of our multifamilies are from the 60s, and their electrical capacity is pretty minimal. In some cases, it's kind of impressive that they're even able to, you know, keep the lights on in the units with what they have. It's not much. And so in a lot of cases, it's just not an option to provide level 2 charging for all of the parking spaces, even with load management. I mean, that was the case in 1234 Solano, where we used a load management system and were able to squeeze out 2 low-powered level 2 chargers, and that was it. And, you know, if we're trying to expand that to all of the parking spaces, it's going to need an electrical upgrade. That's very expensive. It's time intensive. It's something that, you know, PG&E is already having a hard enough time keeping up with all of the capacity needs that are happening throughout the Bay Area. So that's an issue. And another thing that came up as we were working on this was that we realized, you know, even for the buildings like, you know, maybe 1126 Marin, where we were able to get in enough level 2 charging for all of the parking spaces, we're starting to really max out that electrical panel, and we still are wanting that building to fully electrify in the next few years. You know, they're still going to have to comply with the air district ruling about getting electric furnaces and water heaters. And so are we pushing them to get an electrical upgrade at that point and increasing the cost of that project by putting in the charging? And so really trying to think about it holistically sort of complicates all of those factors. So a lot of different things that we found in this process. And I've been kind of taking all of those into account and thinking about different possibilities for a future, you know, more expansive program for EV charging. And I want to just talk about kind of a few different ways that this could go, and, you know, both in sort of the general program development and also the installation models. I'm going to start out with kind of the structure of an incentive itself. And this is sort of a, as you can see, a gradient. There's room in between each of these, but on the one end, that's really more focused on structure and efficiency. There's a direct install program. So this would be something where the city is negotiating with an individual contractor and basically coming up with a price for a specific type of standard installation and saying, okay, you're going to do this type of installation for the buildings. You're going to pay, we're going to pay you this much per building or per charge or whatever. And it's sort of run by the city, and owners can opt into that program. So, we're going to do this installation model. If you want it, you can come and sign up, and you're going to pay this amount, and we're going to pay that amount. A little bit less structured, but still, somewhat more intensive is a structured rebate, as I'm calling it. So this would be one where the owner is finding their own contractor and kind of doing that negotiation process with them. But the rebate is designed to basically say, we're gonna incentivize you to do this specific type of installation. And that could have more or less specificity to it. But, it's kind of saying, we want you to do this type of thing, and that's what we're going to incentivize. You find the contractor that'll do it for you. And then down at the other end of the scale is the more generalized rebate. So this is one that has pretty loose requirements, where maybe it's something like install EV charging and we'll give you a rebate, and we don't really require you to have any particular type. Or maybe we say you get this amount of money for this type of charger and this amount for this type, for level 1 versus level 2 or whatever. And that kind of allows more flexibility for what kind of installation the building owner might want, what might work for their building. But then it also introduces more of that complexity and how exactly do we decide how much money for which type of installations, and there's all these different versions, and how do we categorize them and all of that, right? So it sort of goes along this continuum. From my perspective, based on the work that I did in the pilot project, I'm sort of leaning towards that structure and efficiency side of the spectrum. Because from what I saw, there was really a strong need for technical assistance, and it was very time intensive on staff's part to get into all the complexity with those buildings. And I think if we're going to try to do a larger scale, it's going to be a lot easier if we kind of pick an installation that works and go with it, and not kind of get into all the various permutations of things. That said, there's positives to the more flexible version too, right? One thing I'm going to note briefly is that there is a statewide rebate program that just relaunched called Communities in Charge. It's for level 2 charging. It includes several kinds of buildings, including multifamily, and it offers up to $6,500 per charging port. So it's pretty extensive. So it could be that we say, oh, great, that program's taking care of it, or that we have something that's, here's our program that's a little different, and there's that program that covers this type of installation. I'll also say that in the past, these programs have reached capacity pretty quickly, and it's sort of a challenge for building owners, especially smaller buildings, to plan and be ready to go when these things pop up and become eligible. So I'm not necessarily expecting a ton of applications from Albany for that program. So that's all just a little note here. Now I'm going to go into installation models. If we're going for that more structured approach where we have a specific installation that we're trying to incentivize, there's obviously a ton of different types of installations we could be looking at. But there's one in particular that I think could be really promising for some of those issues that we found in the pilot, and for the kinds of buildings that are really prominent here in Albany. So the concept is that basically we would install a series of 120 volt level 1 outlets that are in the garage right next to each of the parking spaces, and each outlet is connected to the tenant's sub panel. So, each unit has its own sub panel, and every time you go in there into your unit and you turn on the lights, all of that electricity is being billed to your utility account. And so this outlet next to your parking space would work exactly the same way. It's automatically billed to that utility bill. So there's no fancy, automated payment systems involved in that. These outlets also could be covered with like a lockable guard if there was concerns about, people stealing each other's power or anything like that. And also it's generally good practice in outdoor spaces to cover up outlets. So that's an option. And, these are outlets, they're level 1. I'll talk about this a little bit more in a second, but it would be suitable for buildings that have limited electrical service. And it would be essentially, when you buy an EV, they usually come with 2 cords, one that works for 120 volts and one that works for 240 volts, and they have that outlet plug-in. So the owners wouldn't have to buy anything special. They would just be plugging in the cord that comes with their car. Also, you could use it to, charge an electric scooter or an electric bike or anything like that, or put a lamp next to your car if you felt like it. I don't know, whatever you want. So that's the kind of basic concept here. I want to talk a little bit about level 1 versus level 2. This is something that I spent a lot of time thinking about, and it's really a question of opinion, I think, at the end of the day. Level 1 is often called a trickle charge. It's much slower. We're talking about 2 to 5 miles of range per hour of charging. For level 2, it's like 10 to 30 miles of range per hour of charging, right? So overnight, with level 2, you're getting a full charge every single night. With level 1, it's 20 to 60 miles, so not nearly as much. That said, 20 to 60 miles for most people is going to be enough to cover their daily driving needs, right? One thing I want to mention, I put into the staff report that the average miles driven per day in Albany is 9. I was thinking through that number a little bit more and realized it's probably not the most accurate for this use. That's our VMT, that's miles traveled within the city, and then kind of brought down to a population level to help us understand how that changes as our population grows. I did a little bit of research this afternoon and found that kind of average daily driving of the Bay Area as a whole is about 20 miles per day. And I think that's probably a bit more accurate because it's including those commutes out of the city and averaging that out a bit more. So 20 miles a day is probably a more accurate number for us. We don't know, multifamily versus single family. We can't get that granular. But still, for the majority of people, level 1 will do the job. And for those where it's not going to be quite enough, they can still go to a fast charger once a week or whatever, or on the days when they're driving a lot. Or maybe they're able to switch to a plug-in hybrid and they're able to cover most of their commute with electricity. So, it's not ideal, but it is providing access that's enough for most people. The benefits of level 1, first of all, way lower electrical capacity needs. So most buildings, like the vast majority, can handle, including a few more 120 volt outlets. And sub-panels in particular can usually handle this. On the level 2 side, a lot of buildings can't support multiple of these. Some of them can't even support one. A lot of sub-panels also can't support level 2 because the sub-panels have really limited electricity, and so that sort of automatic billing situation wouldn't work. And again, there's an issue of making future electrification more difficult. And then kind of along with that, level 1 also has a lower installation cost. You know, the parts are less expensive. You don't have to do load management systems that are expensive. You don't need to create new sub-panels and all kinds of complicated things. I don't have like particular cost data because it does vary obviously, but in general, level 1 is going to be lower cost. And this sort of installation model that I've proposed is a relatively low cost option. It's probably one of the lowest cost options on the market for putting in EV charging in a multifamily building. Routing to the sub panels, you know, it does add a little bit of expense to do each one to a different sub panel, but it doesn't seem like it's very much, and it's going to save a lot of money in billing in the long run. And, you know, one last note on the cost. As long as you're talking about a parking lot that's next to the electrical panels, it's very doable. If your panels are on a totally different side of the building, then you're going to start getting really expensive. But in Albany, pretty much every building we have that's multifamily, the panels are right next to the parking spaces. You know, I've been in a lot of these buildings, and almost every single time that's what I see. So again, based on the kinds of buildings we have and the sort of usage needs, I do think that this kind of installation concept would fit that well. It would be pretty low cost, and it would work for most buildings very effectively. So to summarize all of that, there are a lot of ways to go. I think this could be promising to do this sort of more structured concept with this installation method, but there are a lot of alternatives and twists and different ways to do it. So I'm really curious to hear all of your thoughts and opinions on this, and to kind of chat about how to move forward and if this kind of program is even worth doing. So with that, I'll stop and take any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle, for that comprehensive overview. Yeah, I'd like to dive further into the technical assistance part, because I think that would help me better understand how we might either get like affordable versions of that technical assistance or design these programs the best structured way that would eliminate it. Mm-hmm. I was just curious if you could talk more about what was the most common forms of assistance that was needed, and like what I guess stage of the project did they came along. Yeah,
great question. So for this original pilot, I was providing the technical assistance. We didn't hire any consultants. And so, you know, part of it was me learning along the way too, but mostly it was a lot of time speaking with the owners. You know, in the very beginning, once we accepted their applications, we had some meetings about, you know, what are the details of your building? Let's talk through all of the different options and different kinds of charging, level 1 versus level 2, et cetera, et cetera. You know, talking about different charging models and exactly what capabilities they had and price comparisons, and kind of really informing them of what all the options were and what they meant. And then we went to the stage of getting quotes from various contractors. So I was finding contractors for them, having meetings with contractors, and I was attending those to kind of help answer some of the questions the contractor had that the owners didn't know the answer to, and ask questions that the owners might not have known to ask, and those sorts of things. Then again, once we got those quotes back, sitting down with the owners, talking through the different quotes, you know, again, comparing the different prices, the different options, the different installation types, helping kind of guide them to a decision about what they wanted, and then helping kind of shepherd through all of the different contracting that had to happen, both between owners and the contractor and the owners and us for the grant, getting everything through the permitting process and making sure stuff didn't get stalled, and then helping with a little bit of kind of making sure everything was running okay once things were installed, and some of the chargers weren't quite connecting to everything right, and talking to owners about what the different automatic payment systems look like and how they work, and walking them through the website. A lot of pieces, in particular, because a lot of the building owners we have here are not professionals. It's, maybe an older couple who invested in a building many years ago, and they're not professionals on any of this stuff. So there was a lot in terms of technical assistance needs. Yeah.
A couple questions. One is, are there examples of other cities who have implemented the model that you envision, which I think is like, level 1 charging
Yeah.
tied to the customer meter?
It's a great question. So, as far as I know, this hasn't really been implemented in a program before. I do know that it's Silicon Valley Clean Energy, that's a CCA. They have a kind of a multifamily charging incentive program that has covered level 1 charging. But I believe that was smart chargers. So, they're basically outlets that have some automated payment software embedded into them. But I haven't heard of anyone that's used this sort of sub-panel approach. I think it would be pretty promising. One thing that did come up was that there was some concern that using an outlet, basically in some cases, the outlet and the charging cable can kind of interfere with each other and cause it to trip the breaker, essentially. But I spent some time asking around about that with some professionals, and it sounds like it's a pretty rare phenomenon and pretty fixable. So that is one thing that came up when I was looking into this, and I think maybe part of the reason it hasn't been as common, but also multifamily buildings are just like very underappreciated in this space, and there hasn't been a lot of work done on it in general. So, yeah, that's all to say, not that I know of.
That's great. I hadn't heard of anything. So. And then on the slide about incentive structures, you had mentioned that there were some conditions that you could apply to a structured rebate. I just kind of wanted to make sure I understood what you
Yeah. So for instance, we could say that we'll offer a rebate for level 2 charging, but not for level 1. Or we will offer a rebate only if there's charging available to all of the parking spaces, or if you make sure that there's either an automatic payment system or it's connected to the sub panels. So basically kind of putting the boundaries around what that installation type can look like, which can, make sure that we're incentivizing the type of installations we want to see, and it can also help kind of build some boundaries to make things a little less overwhelming for owners. But yeah, that's where it kind of becomes this continuum, right?
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, do we have any public comment?
Lucinda Young, go ahead.
I thank you, Michelle. Very good presentation. You mentioned a new level 2 charging rebate. I think you said $6,500 per charging unit. And I'm just wondering what state program that is. I hadn't actually heard about it and just was interested in reading about it. And I'm wondering if the city is doing any outreach to multifamily apartments or multifamily dwellings about this rebate. It seems like something that we should really be encouraging or multifamily dwellings to take advantage of. And if it's like most of these state rebates, they can go very, very quickly. And then I love the suggestion on the 120 volt. I can remember, I believe it was earlier this year, Nick Peterson had sent a very interesting article out, and I think maybe he shared it with you too, Michelle, advocating for just this, that the 120 volt is just so much simpler and so much less expensive for buildings that can't put in the 240 volt. As an EV driver, I've been an EV driver for, I guess, about 7 years now, and have talked to people a lot about EVs. I will say that the biggest hurdle is fear that you're not going to have enough range. And even though, like you say, you pointed out, the average driver, the amount of charge you're going to get at night on a level 1 is going to be sufficient to satisfy the vast majority of your driving needs during the day. But given that there is this anxiety, this psychological anxiety that, gee, I'm not going to have enough range. So that I think would be a hurdle to the level 1. I think it's important that there be a level 3 charger within easy access. I think that would be a solution, but I just wanted to point out that even though most people are driving, under 20 miles a day and the level 1 should be fine, there is this psychological barrier. And I think your structured incentive option, I kind of lean towards that, especially given your experience that the landlords that you spoke to needed a lot of hand-holding. And from my experience talking to not multifamily dwelling owners, but just single residents, people need a lot of hand-holding. The electrification, exploring all the options can be quite overwhelming. Thank you.
No other public comment.
Great. Thank you, Lucinda. We'll move to discussion.
I'm happy to start. Thanks so much for the presentation and analysis. It was really good to learn about the case studies that you did. And I just love this idea that you have for doing level 1. We can't solve everyone's EV problem. Putting in level 1 chargers more ubiquitously, just like saturating Albany's multifamily rental market with outlets, I think gets us a long way towards overcoming EV barriers at a low cost. And I'm just trying to keep in mind that these are private benefits. I feel like there's a piece of the EV puzzle that we can talk about separately that is public charging. This is private charging. So I, as a policy person and taxpayer and all of that stuff, would like to see sort of less spending on private benefits and more spending on public benefits. This is a private benefit. I cannot park my car at these chargers. But at the same time, this is a relatively low investment of public dollars per unit, so we can get economies of scale, meet most people's needs. This addresses the barrier for anyone driving a plug-in hybrid, for example, because they can't charge 100 miles because that's not the capacity of a plug-in hybrid, so it'll make it appealing for plug-in hybrid drivers, EV drivers who have shorter commutes. I think it's just a great plan. Thank you. I think you should copyright it. Call it the Michelle plan or something.
It's a great idea.
Yeah, I mean, I agree wholeheartedly with all of that, including that you should copyright it. At least brag about it. It seems like a really elegant plan from what you've explained about the solution space from the pilot, like simple, the simplest and there's no monthly fees, and you don't have to pay for special equipment. It's minimal technical complexity. But my favorite thing about it is that you could plug in your e-bike. I have an e-bike. I think increasing numbers of residents do, and a number of residents have cargo bikes, which are essentially substitute cars. So we're talking about, all those local trips. You're talking about the earlier figure of the 9 VMT. You can do all of that on your cargo bike, and it would be lovely to make that easy for people. I'd be really happy to see that. So it's a covert bike support as well. So yeah, this is great. Thanks for putting it all together.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. First I do agree with the push towards level 1. Peninsula Clean Energy has really taken that as their main approach to electrifying multifamily homes. They did a small study looking at similar things around commute patterns and found something like 95% of drivers they thought in the area would be met by either having a level 1 charger or what they call a power managed level 2 charger that was split among 3 or 4 drivers. They've really been pushing that as a strategy. They probably have some interesting things to look at how they've structured their incentives. Theirs, I think, are kind of closer to the number 2 you've had, where they have kind of a set amount for level 1 and level 2 chargers, are not offering any incentives for DC fast chargers. And I think they have that power managed requirement for level 2. I think part of me feels a little hesitant for the fully structured one, just because, if the more technically specific we make it, it could potentially cut out potential buildings that just don't fit that mold, or may not be able to evolve if, say, some new cool fin-dangled solution comes out. But I think there's a lot of promise in nudging, eliminating technical assistance by nudging towards solutions we think will work and harmonize well with the other home electrification needs. The only other thing I was going to mention, I noticed in Peninsula Clean Energy, they have a pretty robust technical assistance program. I wasn't sure, I didn't see anything for Ava had anything around multifamily. I wonder if there's any angle. I guess, it seemed like a lot of the CCAs have kind of free technical assistance around this, and I was wondering if what the angles are to advocate for Ava to include something like this.
Anything's possible. Right now, Ava's focusing on their own fleet of DC fast chargers that are co-located near multifamily, but publicly accessible. That's the focus. There might be technical assistance available. I'm not aware if that's.
I will note that the Bayren Bambi program, the multifamily branch, does now offer technical assistance around EV charging. They don't have funding for EV charging, but that's only accessible if you're also trying to get, Bayren funding for other building upgrades. So it's a little bit less accessible.
The only other thing I was going to mention was I did see that about a year and a half ago, PG&E launched a multifamily housing program that I think prioritizes underserved communities. They'll install a no cost, but I think there is some cost sharing option for just if you're in the service territory. So that could also be an interesting one to look at as complementary to if we stand up a city level program.
I really like your presentation, and I really like the comments, too. One thing that struck me a little bit in comparing the 3 buildings you talked about is the one on Portland Avenue has 11 level 2 chargers for 11 parking spaces, which means that a lot of those chargers are sitting idle a lot of the time. And it'd be interesting to see a cost per kWh delivered per charger as a metric to account for the fact that some level 2 chargers can be used by 2 parking spaces rather than just one. My only comment.
Yeah, that's a great point. One thing I'll point out about our pilot is we didn't require that buildings had EV drivers as tenants. And so for most of these chargers, they haven't been used yet. And it's sort of this chicken and egg thing where, if you build it, they will come, right? And, people will feel more comfortable getting an EV once a charger's there, but then what's the argument to put in a charger because no one has an EV? So that's definitely part of the trick. And I think part of the issue with putting in a ton of money for really expensive installations when no one's using it or no one's going to use it for a while. So yeah, like the per kilowatt cost would be very, very high right now if we ran that study. And then also, yeah, for the level 2, for those smart chargers that can track usage, putting it between 2 spaces was, I think, a really effective option because, there's plenty of power to go around and maybe you have to share with your neighbor, but that's probably going to be fine and saves costs. So, yeah.
Is there any way to figure out whether apartments that have access to EV chargers rent for a little more than similar apartments without?
Theoretically, on some of the apartments.com or whatever places you can go, there are options to see if a building has EV charging. The difficulty is that it's still rare enough that it's difficult to actually do the math and figure out what the relative, rent changes are. And also most of the buildings that have EV charging right now are pretty new and pretty large, which isn't the kinds of buildings we have here. So I think basically there isn't enough data yet. But I do think, it's a benefit and a service. So I would imagine that it would make the apartment a little bit more competitive, if not raising the rents a little bit. While we're here, does anyone else have thoughts specific to the sort of structured, unstructured continuum? I know Dan and Katie mentioned, liking the standard installation model. Does that go along with liking the more structured direct install approach? I think, Dan, you mentioned that a bit, or, kind of where does everyone fall on that, or maybe a little undecided? That's fine too.
Well, you mentioned in your presentation that the folks you worked with in the pilot felt overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, the option where the city negotiates with a single contractor and offers a single option, it certainly does not preclude motivated owners from doing whatever they want at any point.
Mm-hmm.
But it might be the option that is least intimidating for people to engage with. And for sure, it would be the most cost-effective, to your point about spending public money on a private good, if the city just had to do one negotiation and did not have to review all of these specific applications for rebates. So to me, that's appealing from a public cost-saving perspective, but also in the hopes that it might make it less daunting for owners.
Yeah, I hate to use a private insurance as a model in this day and age, but maybe you could do it like the sort of in-network, out-of-network, where it's something where the city will install it.
Oh, interesting.
Using the following, we'll use our vendor, and then maybe make an incentive available if they want to use their own electrician, then there's a X dollar incentive and the city will come and verify that it's done properly or something.
Interesting.
I hate to use that model.
That's helpful. Any other thoughts on that?
If I'm a contractor bidding for a kind of a one-size-fits-all, I'd be kind of nervous about how many of the units would end up, how many of the apartment buildings would end up being pretty easy and how many would end up being things that you really had to stretch. So the bids might not be as competitive. So that would argue for, and then there's also, well, to what Dan just said, if the city is doing the installation, there's some liability as well, and maybe that can be dealt with, I don't know. A different model would be to have a city, a contractor who would go out and basically do your role for what you did with these 3 pilots, but to do that on a larger scale for, you know, anybody who comes in the door or maybe pays a small amount of money to show that they're in earnest, and then go to the building, look at it, say, here's what makes sense for you, and then I'll help you put out to bid for a contractor. So that could be a city service that's not quite as structured, it's kind of a little bit in the middle.
Yeah, these are all great ideas and great points. Yeah, there's a lot of questions about exactly how all these things would come into being in reality. So it's useful to have kind of your thoughts on which directions to go in, and then I can go back and spend some time looking at the feasibility of very specific formats. So that's what I'll be doing in the new year.
And what I just said doesn't apply to what we might call the Michelle 120 approach, which I think is great.
If, I don't remember this from the memo that you sent, if the city were to offer the pre-negotiated with the contractor option, what sort of a cost share would there be for owners? Could be anything.
Yeah, I mean, it could be anything. I think we would probably look at what the kind of average cost was likely to be, and then go from there and kind of pick a percentage or something. But yeah, I mean, we could really structure that in any way. So.
Yeah, I'll just put one last comment. Yeah, I think I'm more towards the structure end, but maybe a little more towards your second option of something that gives a little more flexibility for all multi-building. There are more larger swath of multi-buildings to participate, and can be a little more flexible to all the different arrangements that might be possible. I guess the other thing I would have to think about too is just if this applies both to existing and new building. And how our California building standards and Albany's green code kind of like interacts with already mandating some of the
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, we do require EV charging for new buildings. We don't, there's kind of some variations, like they have to have some charging installed and some sort of EV ready spaces. And yeah, I hadn't really considered how that would interact with the program. Although we don't have all that many new multifamily buildings going in each year. But that is definitely something I'll think about. Great. Well, thanks everyone for your thoughts. I'll keep working away at this.
Thanks for the presentation. That was great. Really good analysis. It is 7:59, so I think we're going to do our traditional 5-minute break and come back at 8:04-ish. 04, coming back, and we're going to move to item 6.2, e-bike and transit incentive options.
All right, one moment. Okay. Yep. All right. So this is just a really short presentation. A little bit of background. As you guys know, in the last few months, we've been speaking about various ways to incentivize active transportation, and public transportation has sort of weaseled its way into that as well. In our last few conversations, we talked about how the Transportation Commission and Public Works Department does a lot of the work that's sort of infrastructure focused, which is a really essential part of encouraging active transportation. We talked about a few of the different more incentive or event-based options. And, part of what came out of that conversation was a focus on, conserving city resources to really focus in on those infrastructure projects that make a really big difference rather than the smaller things like crosswalk flags. But there was still some interest in e-bike incentives or transportation incentives. So I want to just talk about that a little bit. This isn't something that I've done a huge amount of analysis on, but I thought it would be helpful to sort of, lay a little bit of groundwork, have a bit of a conversation about it to see how much interest there is and if there's sort of a direction before kind of doing some more in-depth research. So that's what this is about tonight. So e-bikes, obviously e-bikes are a really great tool for encouraging active transportation because they sort of allow access to biking for maybe people who are less experienced with biking, or even, for long trips or hilly trips, or, things where it might be difficult to bike if you didn't have some electric assistance. But they are pretty expensive. The average cost of an e-bike is around $2,000. You can get some for about $1,000 if you're, looking on the cheaper side. And then if you're looking at things like the cargo e-bikes or the sort of the more utility types, those can get up towards $6,000 and beyond. So, some pretty large ticket products here. As I mentioned earlier tonight, there is a large statewide e-bike incentive that just launched. And I mentioned before, it's $2,000 for households below 300% of the federal poverty level. So it's, it's essentially covering the cost of the bike for a sort of average purchase, and is income qualified. 300% of the poverty level is relatively low income. That's going to be a relatively small segment of Albany's population or the state population. But it's already popular. As I mentioned, the first wave has already filled up with applications. So I do think this funding is likely to go pretty quickly. I don't know how much of it, if any, will get into Albany specifically, but perhaps some. And then there are also some smaller programs in existence, some city and county programs, San Mateo County, Santa Cruz, Healdsburg, a few places around this area have programs. They're all kind of in the $300 to $1,000 range for rebates. Some of them have like different amounts for different products, and some are just sort of a standard, but they're essentially covering, a tenth to a half of the cost or something like that. And pretty much all of them have some sort of requirement around income. So either they're only for low-income households, or there's different amounts depending on your income level. But pretty much across the board, this is focused on providing access to lower income homes, which makes sense, considering the cost of the item is it's high for a bike, but for an upper income household, it's probably not a huge expense. So those are the kinds of programs that exist. It's definitely something that we could offer a rebate for as a city. These kinds of incentives are relatively easy in terms of management and administration, especially with relatively low amounts like this. It's something that could be essentially kind of like a sister program to the heat pump rebate program or something like that. And it's something that we would probably want to structure in a way that's similar to these other local programs. I didn't do any outreach to the program administrators to hear about the data on how those programs have gone, but if there is interest in this, it's something I could do and bring that back. So that's an option. And then there's also transit incentives. So this one is a little bit less pinned down in terms of kind of what this looks like. The kinds of transit incentives that we generally see are things that are run by transit agencies. So that's like the START program, the Clipper START program, which offers discounts to various groups, low income individuals, seniors, youth, people with disabilities, all these kinds of groups. And that's something where you can sign up and it basically just works within your Clipper card. And then there's also programs that are for specific organizations. So UC Berkeley has the Student Easy Pass, which gives free transit rides to UC Berkeley students. There are also, lots and lots of examples of specific companies offering free passes or discounts to their members or, to their employees, various kinds of schools, things like that, where it's kind of a specific, tangible group of members, and they set up a program with the transit agency, and they're basically subsidizing that transit travel. So those are all kind of the long-term, ongoing incentives. I didn't find any examples of city-run incentive programs, but the chair did share with me the Contra Costa Tri-Transit program, which is probably the closest thing we could find to something that's, it's county run, but it's similar. And they have essentially like a trial pass. So they give you a $25 Clipper card as an incentive to get you to try out transit and sort of see if it works for you, but it's not an ongoing program. So all that said, there are a few ways the city could try to create transit incentives. We could theoretically try to do something similar to like the Student Easy Pass, where it's, the city residents are the organization members or maybe a subset. But I will say that that's relatively complex as something to set up. And fairly expensive. So, that would require a lot of work with the transit agencies and figuring out how to do these things on a long term, and can we do a discount? Does it have to be free? And, how all that works. So it's something I could look into, but I just don't know much about exactly how that would work and how possible it is. But it's out there. And then there's sort of the one-time incentive option. And this is definitely easier logistically. If we were to basically buy up Clipper cards and preload them with money and then give those away to people for any number of reasons. It could be a tri-transit kind of thing. It could be a prize for something. It could be for, people who meet some specific requirements, whatever. That's a relatively easy thing to do, and it, basically comes down to how much money can the city spend on that, and how do we decide who gets them. I haven't reached out to the program to see how effective it's been, but if there's interest in that, again, something I could do. And possibly there's another version of this that I haven't thought of. Maybe there's some totally different kind of transit incentive that would be amazing. But, you know, it's not like a super common thing for cities to do. So a little bit of an open space for imagination there, perhaps. Yeah, so all that said, those are kind of some things just to lay the groundwork for this conversation. As I mentioned before, I think it's really about whether this is something the committee is interested in pursuing more, if there's a direction that we want to go and kind of more things to look into, or maybe ideas that we want to leave behind.
Any questions? We can move to public comment.
Nick Peterson, go ahead.
Hi, everyone. Nick Peterson, Albany Climate Action Coalition. Encouraging biking, I think, is a really excellent thing for the committee to look into. One thing I would think is just doing it generally to everybody is kind of a high hurdle. One thing I'm wondering is, would it be good to focus on schools, students? I hear a lot of comments about, the big pileup that happens around the schools when school opens and when school closes, with cars, idling and jockeying for positions, and there's a lot of driving and picking up the students going on at schools, even though we're a pretty small city. So it seems like there'd be an opportunity to maybe partner with the school district and come up with a program to incentivize kids to actually use a bike to get to school. Again, it becomes kind of a challenge to how do you know if, say, you provide a rebate on a bike, are they really going to use the bike? Or is it just become something that they get for less, maybe turn around and sell it? So it's kind of a challenge to run those programs, but maybe bringing it up as something in partnership where it's really put forward as an opportunity for kids to challenge one another and do that. Then we'd be building in early on bicycle commuters who would then be more prone to carry that on later as they move into adulthood. Rather than just buying a car to shuttle around, they might stick more with bicycles. I've noticed this with parents who are big bicycle advocates and tote their kids around on bikes. Later, you'll see them biking around with the kids on their own bikes. So there's kind of this early initiation, which I think would be really good. Again, I think it's important that Albany find out what other cities, especially like Berkeley, Oakland, that have larger resources are doing, and if there's some way to partner with an already existing program. The one for encouraging transportation, again, it's, are they going to use it? Will it really offset passenger vehicle miles? So it becomes kind of tricky without having a way to track it or monitor it to really know how it's going to be used. But anyway, I'm glad you're considering this and look forward to finding out more as you investigate it. Thank you.
All right. Lucinda Young, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Michelle. I agree that it's important that our city motivate citizens to bicycle or use public transit, and I see that the rebates would be a way to do that. With this recent state, and I think the reason that the e-bike rebates are being offered as opposed to just conventional e-bikes is that, or conventional bicycles, is that the e-bikes are so much more expensive. With this recent $2,000 state program, and that's just designed for pretty low income people who are 300% below the poverty level. There are a lot of people who are above that, who are, more in between low and moderate income, who it's a real stretch to come up with the funds to buy an e-bike. And I think that there's a real place for the city to fill that need. I do think that any rebate, any e-bike or public transit incentive that we offer should be income-based, but I think it should be broader than the 300%. There are a lot of people that would ride an e-bike who simply can't afford it because they're, moderate income. And I don't know, I've priced e-bikes, and 2,000 seems kind of on the low end. I think that's for the Rad Power bikes, which tend to be less, have not as mechanically sound as some of the other bikes. But I do support a program. Recall that Richmond, I don't know if they still have an e-bike incentive program, but they did in the not too distant past. I think it was $500 if I'm recalling correctly. But thank you for bringing this up.
No other public comment.
We'll move to discussion.
I have two thoughts. First, there's a lot of equity concerns here. In addition, it would help me if it was possible to get a metric of carbon reductions per dollar spent by the city across all of the different metrics. That would require a lot of assumptions, but it would be interesting to get a sense of where the city gets the biggest bang for the buck. Because looking at all these different options, I don't really have an idea. So that would be kind of a heroic analysis with a lot of assumptions, and it doesn't answer all the questions because there's equity concerns here as well. But just something to think about. The second thing is far more specific, but the Michelle 120, I like that idea. And I wonder if it would be, or I haven't thought about this before, but the pros and cons of having a bunch of 120-volt chargers at Albany High School where the electricity was paid for by the city. So kids who rode their bikes to school could charge for free. I'm not sure how much it would cost, how much good it would do, but just a thought to throw out there.
A few thoughts. I appreciated those thoughts. This is a very thought-provoking night, I think. I was just going to add that, program implementation for these programs is really hard. I'm seeing that because Ava is preparing to launch a program, and it's been a really long time in coming, and lots of delays, and just a lot of when you start trying to figure out how do you deal with excessive demand, which there's more demand than supply for these incentives, and how do you verify that someone's low income or income qualifying or whatever as a city. So I had a few thoughts. One is that there are two large programs that are just about to launch. So does the city need to launch a program? Ava will have a program, the state will have this program that was discussed, so there will be some rebates available. And number two, just sort of random brainstorm idea is that at least with Ava's program, it's expected that there will be more demand than rebate money available, and so they'll have to do some sort of lottery or selection. There will be an allocation for low-income customers. Income will be determined by whether they're customers on care, for example. And maybe the city could request to find out how many people in Albany did not get a a rebate, because then that programmatic work will be done. You'll know who the people are and that they applied and that they qualify in different ways, and maybe you could determine whether the city could sort of fill in that gap. You wouldn't get the data for a while, though. It'd be sort of a historic way to develop a program, but I just thought that might take some of the hard programmatic work away, and you just have the applicants there in a queue.
Dan, do you know the amount of the incentives and to whom they'll be offered?
I do, but I'm not supposed to.
Okay.
It's like not really publicly disclosed yet. It'll be in 2025, and it'll be sliding scale for low income or not, and there will be different amounts for like a regular bike versus a cargo bike. And it'll be like hundreds to, I think, just over 1,000, like in that range.
Okay, and the program will start early, mid-2025, end of 2025?
Mid-2025.
Okay,
It's, yeah.
all right. I mean, I really like that idea as a labor saver, to just pick up the overflow and let someone else figure out who gets it. That seems lovely as a possible partnership. So, I mean, I guess one request I would have is maybe if it's possible to check in with Ava about the parameters of their program and see if that might be.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting idea. I hadn't thought of that, but I can definitely ask about that.
The other cool thing about partnering with Ava is that they know what it actually costs to live in the East Bay. Because I looked up what is 300% of federal poverty level, and I was like, there's almost nobody in Albany who is making that income because they wouldn't be able to pay rent. So I imagine that the AVA program will serve the more moderate income residents. So that seems really appealing as a possibility. Yeah, I mean, because I was gonna make the comment that Lucinda made, which is that the state rebates are cool, and we won't get that. Well, I don't want to flip to transit if anyone has other things to say about bikes.
I just have one first. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about what Nick mentioned about the potential to just like flip these bikes in another city that's at full price. You'd hope everyone who gets the incentive is operating in good faith, but yeah, it is hard to see the carbon impact, and if these bikes are actually being used. So yeah, I did like that idea of finding strong partners for whatever type of rollout we do. I don't know if that's like dovetailing with anything in the active transportation plan, or the school one was great. I saw, and after Lucinda mentioned that Richmond one, I saw that, they used kind of a double carrot approach of e-bike incentive plus an extra incentive if you use it to ride across the bridge. So I don't know if there's any promotional events we could do in Albany to tie of riding around Albany or something. But I like that kind of approach of some type of wraparound events to make sure the bikes are going to good use.
Yeah, that reminded me of something. I mean, this is definitely not cheat-proof, but if you have a mile counter on your bike, you could potentially have a rebate contingent on traveling a certain amount of miles on your bike, like you won't actually get the rebate until you have used your bike. But you could, if someone was really motivated to flip their bike, they could do that. But then they would have had to hang on to the bike for several months, so it probably wouldn't be as appealing. Any other discussion about the bike part of this? Oh, Mark, what did you mean about equity issues?
The idea of free electricity for Albany High people who ride their bikes to school, that would apply to the children of high-income people and the children of low-income people. So I just don't see any way to break that out whereas all of the rebates, it makes sense that, you know, they're targeted towards low income, there's declining, that's all I meant.
So I had a comment on the transit possibility. So that tri-transit thing, which was fairly low cost, that was like the one-time free card. It looked from the website that they had been doing this for about 5 years. I don't know if continuously for 5 years, but the program is at least 5 years old. And that they require participants to follow up I don't know how they can require them to follow up and give feedback on, you know, how they used transit and whether their behaviors changed. So I think as a next step of exploring that, I'd love to learn what they've learned. Like I would assume the fact that it's been going on for 5 years suggests that it does change behaviors on some scale. Or it might just suggest that it's a really cheap program, so they haven't needed to cut it. So I would love to learn more about that. And then if it's something you can look into, super. If it isn't, I could look into it too, because that seems interesting to me as a simple, low-cost way to maybe drive people to transit. I mean, there was a BART presentation at City Council last week, and ridership is still quite low, which means a lot of people, by inference, a lot of people in our town who used to ride BART just don't do it anymore. And some of those people are just full-time work from home, but others maybe just need to be like nudged. I don't know. And I don't know to what extent, whether Contra Costa has collected data on that. I don't know. So that would interest me. I concur completely that like an ongoing thing, like the kind of transit benefits that people get at their jobs is like well beyond the scope, I think, of a small city. Be complicated.
Does anyone else have opinions on that in particular? I think part of what I'm trying to tease out here is whether the committee as a whole is interested in that kind of a program and whether it's kind of worth continuing to work on, or the committee is not really interested in pursuing it.
I mean, if it wasn't obvious, I'm really excited about it.
Yeah. It has to be more than just you.
Yeah, I know. So that's why I'm kind of encouraging, I want to know what people think. And the reason why I'm excited about it is just that, like, that's transportation is half our in-town emissions. So we need to do something substantial about it. And this is one logistically somewhat easy thing to do.
I mean, I support generally, you know, what you're saying. I have less of a vision for what the city would do or how they'd dispense public transit funds or whatever. I just don't see it. It just doesn't mean it's not like I'm just not, I don't know. But I love it. And, you know, I've worked at places that offer transit benefits to me as an employee, and that's nice, you know. I don't know if I don't know if there's any data on whether it moves the needle or not in terms of transit ridership. But I might be interested in that if anyone has info or has like a specific proposal for what a program would look like, who would benefit and how. But yes, generally supportive of getting people on public transit and sort of stewing on what this committee can do to make a difference.
Yeah, I also agree that this should be like one of the top priorities. I think as someone who's like directly benefited from Berkeley's free bus system, and they're working on making a ballot that would make BART free too. They're doing like a pilot program right now for students. And just knowing that like how much safer the streets are also with less traffic and less cars on the road, and just offering other alternatives to get, you know, not only emissions down, but also safety up for people. yeah, I think should be one of the top priorities, and highly am in favor of putting this high up the list.
Yep. Yeah, I like the ideas that Katie, you were pursuing there of talking to Contra Costa to get information of, yeah, how has their thesis done that, you know, you can jumpstart people back into transport with a little bit of a nudge. And I do agree that I think it sounds like an ongoing provider, the city as an ongoing provider of these benefits could be logistically challenging and potentially be just something hard to budget for. It's basically an endless incentive. So yeah, I do think it is worth pursuing. What are these small, high-impact nudges we can do to get people using transport as a habit, either starting early or getting them reassociated with using it.
Okay, thank you, that's helpful. I'm just looking back over my notes about the, going back to the e-bikes. So for e-bikes, I was also getting a kind of similar thing, that there's interest in looking into some options, in particular maybe trying to build off of the AVA program. And yeah, maybe looking at partnering with the high school a bit, but also kind of feeling like there might be some problems with it, so not necessarily super gung-ho about the idea. Does that mostly capture the feeling? Like, it's a little bit challenging, but worth spending a little bit more time looking into.
Yeah, that's how I felt. For me, it felt more of a wait and see with how Ava's program goes. Since
Okay.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of thoughtful design has gone into that program, and will serve a lot of the, we'll serve Albany, so we can from that.
Yeah, I'm always enthusiastic about when we can work at a regional level, because these regional orgs already exist, so it would be great if we could just kind of piggyback and support. I mean, assuming that that's needed, but I expect it probably will be, given how fast the state rebates are going.
And the city can definitely promote that program locally to try and get more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
From all.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. I feel like I have an understanding of where the committee is at now, so that's what I was looking for.
We are on to item 6.3, subcommittee updates. We have one subcommittee.
And we did not meet.
And that's what we got. Let me cross that off the list. So now we're on to, and I'd like to go to the public first for this. Any requests for future agenda items?
Nick Peterson, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Nick Peterson, Albany Climate Action Coalition. So I've kind of been thinking a lot about how this group can influence the council and influence action in the city more effectively. And it seems like we do run into the, a lot of things have been suggested, but they're hard to implement even now, talking about bike programs and transit programs. They're hard for a small city to implement. And I think if there was a way for the city to really do more collaborating at a regional level, or working with regional groups like AVA, like Bay Area Air Quality Management District, or others that have better resources in order to establish programs that benefit larger more than just the city to, and then there's also seems to be a kind of a redundancy. If everybody has their own little incentive programs, how do they stack up? How do they work together? Who do they really benefit? Is there equity involved? All gets kind of complicated, and it seems like really these things should be happening actually at a federal level, but they're not, or at a state level, or at least a regional level. But for Albany as a small city to try to initiate, and I've seen this since when I was sitting on the Climate Action Committee, to actually get things to happen and be able to fund them is a real challenge. So I'm wondering how efforts of the committee and of staff could be more directed to collaborations, to sending, bringing forward ideas. For example, we have a big hole in understanding how existing buildings are adapting and moving away from fossil fuel. There's no database. We can kind of look at building permit data and kind of check on that. That was one of the ideas of the Carbon-Free Albany, was that if people sort of registered their homes and started doing work, you could glean some data from that. But of course, that didn't get the participation that was needed. So I think there needs to be some advocacy and some collective requests with regional agencies and state agencies to set up some sort of more standardized database where, say, homeowners put in, what they've done to move off of fossil fuels, and it becomes sort of a standardized thing, much like what has happened in Europe. I mean, Europe's been doing it for 30 years with energy efficiency ratings for properties. But we don't do that here. And it seems like collaborating is the best way to do. So if something could happen to sort of increase the collaboration. Thanks.
Lucinda Young, go ahead. Lucinda.
Yes, thank
oh,
you. I support what Nick just spoke to as well, that some collaboration or, exploring collaboration with other groups is important, especially given that we are a small city. I have concerns, and again, I know this is new agenda, but I don't know if this neatly fits into new agenda, but I have a concern about a lot of climate-related decisions happening without this committee really having a say in it, and what, if anything, can be done about that. I think there's a lot of expertise on this committee, and decisions related to climate need to, this committee needs to have some input on them. A couple of things that come to mind is a couple of city council meetings ago, I think it was the end of last month, there was a suggestion, it was on the agenda for the city to divest from fossil fuels, and there was quite extensive discussion about it, and it is being referred to staff for further, I guess, report. But I don't think that this committee had any input on that, and it seems that it should. Another example that occurs to me is earlier this year, you heard a lot of us expressing concern about the police department's purchase of another gas parking enforcement vehicle, and relying on very cursory report from the police saying that there weren't not good electrical options. That seems like something that this committee should have had some input on. And another thing that is occurring to me, a couple months ago, the Planning and Zoning Committee was reviewing reducing the setback requirements for heat pumps, because that's it's a big barrier for a lot of homeowners in trying to install heat pumps. And I don't know that this committee was consulted or had some say in that as well. So those are just a few examples. I'd just like to see the climate decisions that this committee have some input on. And the other thing I wanted to mention, the building code was amended, I believe it was about a year ago, to, and we all celebrated when it was amended to require for any substantial remodels or new construction, it be completely electric. And I understand that's not being enforced. And I think it was because of the Berkeley decision. I understand that's why, but it doesn't seem that city council ever made a decision on that. I'm not sure how it was decided, but other cities
Thank you,
are
Lucinda.
continuing to.
Sorry, your time's up.
Thank you.
Thank you for your comments.
No other public comment.
Do people on the committee have future agenda items?
At some point, I'd like to discuss public EV charging again. I know we haven't met in our subcommittee in a while, but I think there were a couple follow-up items, like maybe hearing from the person in Alameda about their experience.
Do you mean public charging on private chargers on public property?
Yeah, publicly accessible level 2 charging, basically.
I think I just want to add my voice in support of what Lucinda was saying about wanting to improve communication so that things that the city council is considering that impact climate are somehow communicated. Something to think about. Any more agenda item requests? Like, we don't want to stack it too high because we don't know who we will be in 1 month. All right, well, thanks, everyone. That concludes our meeting for December.
And our next meeting will be on January 15th, 2025.